Japan's birth rate is at an all-time low, and the solution that often gets thrown around to this problem is immigration. But one thing that is not discussed when this solution gets brought up is that Japan is increasingly having difficulty attracting talent. This might come as a shock to many of you, especially because Japan has actually seen a record number of foreign residents in the country recently. But as someone that not only grew up in Japan during my formative years, but also having lived in Japan after graduating university, I want to give you a different perspective to think about. And in fact, although it might not seem like it now, I believe that my analysis will actually age incredibly well over time. First, let's start with the fact that Japan is slowly starting to have trouble retaining native talent. Young Japanese people are moving to countries like Australia and Canada as life in Japan becomes increasingly difficult. This is due to the weakening of Japanese currency as well as the overall decline in the quality of life in Japan, with wages not being actually much higher than working at a decent company in emerging economies like Thailand. For example, the average tech salary in Japan is actually around $36,000 USD, which means that Japan only ranks 26th globally in annual tech salary. And it's important to remember that this average actually skews higher due to working class people being dominated by older demographics because, well, Japan is full of aging population. And Japan is a society where salary is heavily tied to age and seniority and not your performance. Here's like an actual example of a pretty well-known and massive tech conglomerate in Japan and their new graduate salary, which is listed on their official website. The salary begins at 300,000 yen or around 1,875 US dollars per month in today's exchange rate, which adds up to around 22,000 US dollars per year. Typically, you do end up getting compensated slightly more than what is listed when you consider things like bonus and overtime as well as various other benefits. But of course, this is still nowhere near the compensation of a tech worker in places like America. Anecdotally, I know for a fact that the starting salary of some of the best tech companies in Japan is around 5 million yen or around $31,000 in USD per year in today's exchange rate. And remember that this 31,000 USD is considered a good starting yearly salary in Japan. In reality, most Japanese people aren't working for the best and the biggest companies, with the average starting salary of new graduates in the country actually being around 14,000 to 16,000 USD a year. And this also doesn't even take into account the lack of opportunities to move up organizationally compared to many countries around the world. On top of the weak salaries, you also have the declining value of yen, which has effectively wiped out more than 30% of its value since 2021. The situation is so bad that you have IT workers from Bangladesh and Filipino house workers complaining about how bad things are in the country, and all this could effectively threaten Japan's ability to attract foreign workers. Japan has also seen brain drains of some of their best tech researchers to Korea and China as Japan becomes increasingly less competitive in technological innovations, and there simply is not enough tenure position for young scientists in Japan, forcing many to seek employment outside of the country. Japanese work culture and corporate structure is also not very good either. Over-reliance on paperwork, outdated technological infrastructure, lots of red tapes and bureaucracy, all means that everything is excruciatingly inefficient to the point where the country has the lowest productivity in all of G7 despite long working hours. Young Japanese people are increasingly becoming more fed up with this, and we are seeing more and more Japanese youth quit as soon as they join a company due to poor working conditions. This is where I need to take the time to explain to you a little bit about Japanese work culture, because most of you have never worked or lived in Japan. Japan is a country where job hopping the way that you might see in the West is uncommon, and traditionally even frowned upon. When you graduate from college and you join a company, it's often expected for you to stay in that company for the rest of your life. And so the fact that young people are quitting as soon as they join a company is actually a lot bigger deal than you think. And a concerning chunk of these young youth do not actually integrate back into the workforce at all, with Japan experiencing what they call a hikikomori problem, which is when people completely drop out of society, refusing to go outside, work, or even interact with anyone socially. And this number has actually been on the rise, with it currently representing 1 in 50 people, or around 1.5 million people, with fears actually that the numbers could climb as high as 10 million people. Recent survey shows that only 57% of Japanese people feel happy, making them the third lowest country in the survey. And when Japanese people were asked, do you think that you and your family will be better off in 5 years? Japanese people had the lowest rate, with only 9% saying yes. And really, this should not be surprising considering that more than 60% of Japanese people do not feel financially secure, with the numbers seemingly getting worse. Japan has seen a record number of tourists over the past year precisely because the country has become increasingly affordable due to the decline in economic power. And tourists are oftentimes shocked at how cheap things are in Japan and actually even envy the country for its affordability, all without realizing that those cheap prices are something that many Japanese households are struggling with. Japan is facing a 41-year high inflation. Parents are struggling to give their children a nutritionally balanced meal, with 37% saying that they aren't even able to afford meat and fish. Some households are even cutting back on the usage of air conditioning and giving up children's extracurricular activities to save money. Probably the biggest indication of things changing for Japan is the declining power of Japan's most dominant political party, the LDP. This is the party of Shinzo Abe and the current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The LDP has been in power for nearly 70 years, dominating Japanese politics. This is why Japan is considered by many to be effectively a single-party state even though it is a democratic nation. But the current government now has a historically low approval rating. Right now, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is being asked to step down and recently lost the by-election where they were completely swept. And the reasons for this outside a corruption scandal is because of inflation, declining birth rate, and poor economy, all of which the government has failed to address. Japanese people are politically very conservative and rarely like to change things up unless they really need to. And the fact that things are changing indicates that things are getting dire. To compensate for this, Japan is looking to increase their high-skilled talent by opening the country up to immigration. But Japan is ranked 41 in attracting foreign talents. In fact, Japanese scholars like Professor Oi Shinana have pointed out that actually immigration laws in Japan for highly skilled migrants are rather quite lenient compared to other developed countries. But the reason why so few move to Japan is because it is an unattractive destination for high-skilled and high-achieving migrants. And this is, in my experience, absolutely true, even more so today. Like for example, Japan has an immigration scheme where they will just give you a visa for simply graduating from a top 100 university in the world. But whether any of these people would be actually willing to come to Japan is a different question. Additionally, Japan has a poor 30% retention rate for international graduate students in the country, which is below that of OECD standards. Many international students end up leaving Japan after graduating, and even when these students want to stay in Japan, the jobs that are actually available in the market is simply not attractive enough. Japan is also beginning to struggle attracting other Asian talents to their country, which is a big deal because Chinese and Koreans historically made up much of Japan's immigration. And due to the increasing quality of life in Korea and China, many young people would rather stay in their own country than move. We see this reflected through GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity, where Japan is considered below that of South Korea, whose average salary has actually outpaced the country in 2022, with wages of Korean graduates being 59% higher than Japan's, with major tier 1 cities in China having comparable or even better quality of life than some of the biggest cities in Japan. And there's generally more optimism for the future prospect of China, who is a rising power. Wages are consistently going up, and we're at a point where China is beginning to transition into becoming a scientific superpower, alongside the country beginning to increasingly produce high-quality, innovative goods rather than cheap, low-quality products that are often associated with the Made in China label. Another thing that is not often mentioned is that Japan struggles to compete with other nations like US, Canada, and Europe when it comes to attracting foreign talents. If you are an Indian engineer who is qualified to move to Japan, there's actually a very good chance that you also probably qualify to move to countries like the United States and Canada. And in that scenario, the chance of someone choosing Japan over these Western countries is low, not just because of pay, but also because a well-educated person in India probably speaks better English than they speak Japanese, meaning that they can adapt to any English-speaking Western countries better. On top of that, what makes Japan appealing, like the culture for example, isn't something that is going to be the motivating factor behind why an economic migrant would move to Japan. A white person in America might make the financial sacrifices to move and live in Japan because they culturally love the country. But the chance of someone from India whose primary goal is to make money to feed their family doing that is going to be lower. Other things like safety, cleanliness, and good city infrastructure, which might be an appealing aspect of Japan, is increasingly becoming available in other countries like Singapore, UAE, South Korea, and more. Singapore is just as clean and well built and even safer in many aspects than Japan is. And some of these countries like South Korea are also looking to loosen immigration restrictions due to declining population, which means that the competition for talent becomes fierce. Because Japan has trouble attracting talents, they recently greatly expanded their criteria to attract people from poorer countries, including the SSW visa, which is a visa specifically targeting blue-collar workers, taxi drivers, truck drivers, nurses, nannies, and more. And they're planning to target 820,000 people with this visa, alongside Japan's technical internship program, a controversial program, largely because it's seen as a way to import extremely cheap labor from countries like Nepal and Philippines to exploit while putting these laborers in debt and subjecting them to slave-like work conditions. And all of these programs have seen short-term success. Like for example, at the very beginning of the video, I mentioned that Japan now has a record number of foreign workers in the country, and the bulk of these foreign workers are actually made up of these visa types. And if you've walked around the neighborhoods of Shinjuku and Shibuya in the past year, you will have certainly noticed a significant increase in foreign workers from the global south. But bringing immigration like this only masks the problems within society. For example, bringing immigrants could offset the declining population, but it doesn't do anything to solve the outdated work culture which is frustrating a lot of young Japanese workers. Never mind the fact that bringing immigrants like this while the quality of life for the native population declines is the recipe for rising ethnic tensions, something that we are seeing in Europe. Now recently, the Japanese government has released a report citing a high retention rate of foreign workers at 40%, a number that is higher than Germany and Netherlands. However, there are a couple of things to note about this number. Even though this report was released in 2024, the actual data looks at the years between 2011 to 2017, and obviously the economic realities of the country has greatly changed since then. This 40% retention rate was also when the country had tough immigration standards standards, which is tied to the complicated employment system. If you were the type of person to move to Japan despite these tough systems, there's a really good chance that you really wanted to move to Japan from the start anyways, and these types of people of course are way more likely to stay, all of which is actually acknowledged by the researchers of the reports themselves. And as for Japan having a higher retention rate of foreign talent than countries like Germany, although the stats for Germany's previous migrant retention rate is difficult to find, there does seem to be studies as far back as 2008 which suggest that Germany actually had a higher immigration retention rate a long time ago when they had strict immigration policy like Japan did. When your country opens up and loosens immigration standards and you bring in more people, it's expected for that retention rate to actually drop. And it's also expected to drop if the economy begins to struggle, which is actually what has happened in Germany and what is beginning to happen in Japan, as Japan actually recently lost a spot for the third largest economy to Germany and projected to lose the fourth spot to India very soon. There are other things that the report did not take into consideration, like the fact that migrants during this time period were mostly East Asians from China and Korea, who are much more able to adapt to Japan due to similarities in East Asian culture. So even though the report is boasting a 40% retention rate, the government still seems to be cautious, even advising for more immigration reform to make things easier. People need to understand that Japan has been very reluctant to bring immigration for a long time, and it still is. So the fact that they're opening up despite the reluctance is a big red flag for the state of the country. It's a desperate move and frankly speaking not something to be celebrated. Japan is now having to lower their standards to the ground, and it seems to be working in short term with the record number of foreign residents, but how this will work in the long term is difficult to say. Ultimately, the future of Japan is uncertain, but few things are for sure, which is that Japan is no longer competitive enough, and its decline in economic power just means that they will struggle to attract more talent. And even if they do manage to attract talent, the incentive to stay is increasingly becoming harder to find. This problem is an existential problem for Japan, and I do believe that I am early in pointing out this growing problem. I am also certain that as years go by, you will begin to hear more about this. And as unfortunate as it is that I have to make this video, it's something that Japan will need to resolve if it wants to stop its decline.